Welcome to a deep dive into human development. You know, that journey we all take from a single cell to the complex people we are today.
Really is incredible when you think about it.
It is. We're using Boyd's Lifespan Development as our guide for this deep dive.
Great choice.
Focusing specifically on the first two chapters, we'll be uncovering how this field has evolved and taking a closer look at those early stages of development. It's going to be fascinating, I think. For example, did you know that our understanding of how humans develop has radically changed over time?
No, absolutely. Like what we know now is so different from even a few decades ago.
And how much do our genes really determine who we become? What do you think?
That's the classic nature versus nurture debate, right?
Exactly. And we're going to dive into that and much more. Boyd even covered some fascinating stuff about prenatal development.
Oh yeah, the impact of all those environmental factors on a growing fetus. So important.
It is. Okay, so to kick things off, let's talk about how this whole field of lifespan development research has evolved.
You know, it's interesting how those early theories, while groundbreaking at the time, often viewed development as something finite, culminating in adulthood.
Like once you hit adulthood, that's it, you're done developing.
Pretty much, yeah. But thankfully, further research proved that that wasn't the case at all.
So more of an ongoing process.
Absolutely. Development continues throughout our entire lifespan. It has twists, it has turns, and each stage presents unique challenges and opportunities for growth.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
It really is a lifelong process. So we've kind of debunked this myth of development ending in adulthood. What were some of the factors that prompted this shift in our understanding? Was it simply because those early pioneers, folks like Freud and Piaget, focused primarily on those younger years?
Yeah, I think that definitely played a role. Like Freud and Piaget, their work was incredibly influential in the field, but they did tend to focus on childhood and adolescence. They often viewed adulthood as more of a plateau, a period of stability.
Gotcha. So did someone come along and challenge that view? Like who really pushed for this idea of lifelong development?
Well, Erik Erikson, for example, he proposed those 8 stages of psychosocial development.
Oh yeah, I remember learning about those.
And his stages, they span from infancy all the way to old age. He argued that each stage presents a unique conflict that individuals must resolve to move forward.
Interesting. So it's not just about physical growth or even cognitive development, but also these social and emotional challenges we face throughout our lives.
Exactly. And it's not just psychology driving this field forward either. We've got biology, sociology, anthropology, all these disciplines coming together.
It really paints a picture of just how complex we humans are. So many factors interacting to shape who we become.
It's amazing.
And of course, we can't forget about the impact of technology. Imagine being able to see brain activity in real time, or trace how specific genes affect behavior.
It's mind-blowing. Tools like brain imaging and genetic testing have revolutionized how we study development. We can actually peek inside and see how our biology interacts with our experiences.
That's wild. And what about those longitudinal studies? The ones that follow people for years, even decades?
Yeah. They're essential for understanding how early experiences, like our relationships and the environments we grew up in, how those things have a lasting impact. They give us a window into individual change over time, which is super valuable.
All this is really impressive. But even with all these advancements, isn't studying human development still kind of like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces?
Yeah, it can feel that way sometimes. I mean, there are so many factors intertwined, biological, environmental, social. It's incredibly difficult to pinpoint the exact effect of every single one.
It's like trying to untangle a giant knot.
Exactly. And to make things even more complicated, you have to consider individual differences. What might be considered normal or typical in one culture or socioeconomic group might be totally different in another.
Well, that's a great point. Like what we think of as normal development even changes over time, right?
Absolutely. What was considered normal development a few decades ago might be viewed very differently today. So trying to generalize findings, especially from older research, can be tricky.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's finally dive into Boyd's book now.
Let's do it.
Chapter 1 of Lifespan Development, it jumps right in, focusing on development from conception all the way to death.
It's a pretty comprehensive overview, and one of the things it really emphasizes is that development is multidirectional.
Multidirectional.
Meaning it's not just about gaining abilities, we also experience loss throughout life. It's a much more nuanced view than just the idea of growing up.
I like that perspective.
Yeah.
It acknowledges that development is this ongoing process of growth, A&D refinement, throughout our entire lifespan. Which, of course, brings us to the age-old question, nature versus nurture. To what extent do our genes determine who we become, and how much of it is shaped by our experiences? What does Boyd have to say about that?
Well, chapter 1 really digs into that. It doesn't try to give a definitive answer.
So it's not about picking sides.
No, not at all. It frames it as this really fascinating interplay between our genetic predispositions and our lived experiences.
So it's not a competition between nature and nurture. They work together to create each unique individual.
Exactly. And then Boyd introduces these two contrasting ideas. Continuity versus discontinuity.
Okay, so continuity versus discontinuity.
It's like asking, is development gradual, like a slow climb up a hill, or does it happen in distinct stages, like climbing a staircase?
Well, that's a great way to put it.
And then there's another question, stability versus change. Do our personalities basically stay the same over time, or do we fundamentally change as we move through life?
I guess we're all trying to reconcile who we were, who we are now, and who we might become, right?
Right. It's a lot to ponder. But one thing is certain, we don't develop in a vacuum.
Meaning we're not isolated individuals.
Yeah.
What shapes us?
Everything. Our families, the culture we grow up in, the historical events we live through. It all plays a role.
That makes a lot of sense. Boyd calls this contextual development, right? We're embedded in this web of relationships and influences that shape our paths.
Exactly. Now let's talk about some of the main theories that try to explain development, shall we?
Okay, I'm ready. What's first?
Well, we have those psychoanalytic theories pioneered by folks like Freud, of course, and Erikson. They really delve into the unconscious mind. It's all about how those internal conflicts and early childhood experiences impact our personalities and relationships.
So it's about those hidden desires and conflicts lurking beneath the surface.
Exactly. Then we have those behavioral and social cognitive theories. They put the focus on how we learned through interacting with our environment.
Okay, so that's more about external forces shaping us. What are some of the names associated with that?
Think of people like Skinner and Bandura. They emphasize the role of rewards, punishments, and observation in shaping our behavior.
So it's not just what's going on inside our heads, but also how we respond to the world around us.
Precisely. And then we have the cognitive developmental theories. Piaget, he was a big name in this area. He focused on how our thought processes evolve over time, from magical thinking when we're young to more abstract reasoning as we get older.
It's amazing how much our thinking changes throughout our lives.
It really is. And Vygotsky, he added another layer to this. He came up with the sociocultural theory, emphasizing how culture and social interaction drive cognitive development.
So we learn through collaborating and using the tools our culture provides.
Exactly. And finally, there's Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory. He viewed development as happening within these layers of environmental influence.
Oh, I've heard of that. It's like those Russian nesting dolls.
Yeah.
Each layer impacting and interacting with the others.
Exactly. You've got that immediate family layer, then the community, then broader cultural influences, and even historical events. It's a holistic view, recognizing that the individual and their environment are interconnected.
So it's not just nature versus nurture, it's this whole ecosystem that shapes who we become.
Precisely. Now, Boyd also briefly touches on research methods used in developmental research.
We already talked about longitudinal studies. What are some of the other methods used to study development?
Well, you have cross-sectional studies, which give you a snapshot of different age groups at one point in time. They're quicker and cheaper than longitudinal studies, but they don't give you that long-term perspective.
Gotcha. So they're good for some things, but not others.
Right. And then there are cross-sequential studies, which kind of combine those two approaches. They're a clever way to track changes over time while also comparing different age groups.
So researchers are constantly refining their methods to get a clearer picture of how we develop.
Well, I think we did a great job covering the key points from chapter 1. What stood out to you the most?
I think what really struck me was this shift from viewing development as ending in adulthood to recognizing it's a lifelong journey. And also this idea that our genes, our environment, and even our own choices all interact to shape who we become. It really is a fascinating and humbling realization, isn't it? To see just how much goes into making us who we are.
It is.
Okay, any final thoughts on chapter 1 before we move on to chapter 2?
It was a great introduction. It laid the foundation for understanding the core concepts and theories of development, which we'll see play out in those later stages we'll talk about, it definitely makes you want to keep exploring.
It does. And I'm ready to learn more about those biological foundations of development and that incredible journey from conception to birth. Let's jump into chapter 2.
Okay, sounds good. So chapter 2 starts by explaining the basics of genetics and heredity. DNA, genes, chromosomes, the building blocks of life.
It's amazing to think that a single molecule, DNA, holds the blueprint for an entire human being.
It really is. And this chapter does a great job breaking it all down. It explains those basic principles, including genotype and phenotype.
Okay, remind me. Genotype is what?
Genotype is our genetic makeup. It's the actual genes we inherit from our parents. Phenotype is what we see, our observable traits, our physical appearance, personality, even our health.
That makes sense. So does chapter 2 answer the question of how much our genes actually determine these traits?
It explores that question, for sure. It goes back to that interplay between nature and nurture, which is super complex. And sometimes those genetic instructions, they have glitches. That's when we get into genetic disorders.
Oh, right. Like Down syndrome, for example.
Exactly. The chapter covers various genetic disorders and the challenges they can present. But thankfully, we have genetic counseling,
which helps people understand their risks and make informed decisions about family planning, right?
Right. Genetic counseling is a vital resource, offering guidance and support to individuals and families.
Definitely important. Okay, so chapter 2 also talks about methods for detecting genetic conditions in fetuses, things like amniocentesis and chorionic villus sampling.
Yeah, those advancements have really changed the game. But it's not just about identifying potential issues, it's about giving people information so they can make informed choices.
I see. So knowledge is power, right?
Absolutely. Okay, are you ready to move on to prenatal development?
I am. It's such a fascinating topic.
Well, chapter 2 takes us through those incredible stages of prenatal development. It starts with that very first stage, the germinal stage, which is the first 2 weeks after conception.
The very beginning. It's incredible how much happens in such a short amount of time.
I know. We have fertilization, then those cells start dividing like crazy, and then the embryo implants itself in the uterus. It's a period of immense transformation.
It is. And then we move on to the embryonic stage, right? That's weeks 3 through 8.
Yeah, that's when those major organs and systems start to develop. The heart begins to beat, the brain and spinal cord form, and those tiny limbs start to bud.
So cute. But I also know this is a really vulnerable time for the developing embryo.
You're right. This is when those teratogens can have the biggest impact.
Teratogens. Remind me what those are.
Those are harmful substances that can negatively impact development. Things like alcohol, tobacco, certain medications, even environmental toxins.
Ah, right. So it's crucial to avoid those things during pregnancy, especially during those early stages.
Exactly. The chapter also stresses the importance of prenatal care, good nutrition for the mom, a healthy environment, all that.
It really underscores the importance of the prenatal environment, like the mother's well-being directly impacts the baby's development.
It's a shared journey, for sure.
And finally, we reach the fetal stage, which is week 9, all the way to birth. That's when the baby really starts to put on weight and those organs mature.
It's the final preparation for life outside the womb.
Like the grand finale, right?
Exactly. Then comes birth, which is a huge moment for both mom and baby. It marks the beginning of a whole new chapter.
What about those first moments after birth?
That's the neonatal period, which is super important for bonding and those early connections. It really sets the stage for the baby's future development.
So much happens in these first 2 chapters. It's amazing. We've covered the evolution of this whole field, the nature-nurture debate, those key theories of development.
And we've explored the fascinating world of genetics and witnessed that incredible transformation from a single cell to a fully developed baby. It's pretty remarkable.
It is. What's one thing you want our listeners to take away from this conversation so far?
I'd say the main takeaway is that human development is this incredibly complex process. It's shaped by our biology, our environment, and our experiences right from the very beginning.
I love that. It reminds us how interconnected we all are and how those early influences really do shape who we become.
Exactly.
Welcome back to our deep dive into human development.
I'm excited to be back.
Me too. In the last part, remember we talked about the evolution of the field itself and explored that amazing journey of prenatal development.
We covered a lot of ground, from those early theories to the impact of genes and environment.
It is incredible to think about all that happens before a baby is even born.
Mind-blowing.
But for this part, let's move beyond the womb.
Okay.
We'll be exploring those first few years of life, that period of infancy and toddlerhood.
Ah, yes. A time of incredible growth and change.
It really is. It seems like development just explodes during those first few years.
Absolutely. We see changes in every area. Physically, cognitively, and social-emotionally. Those tiny newborns transform into walking, talking little people so quickly.
It's amazing to watch. So where do we even begin with all this? What are some of the biggest milestones during this period?
Well, first and foremost, brain development is happening at an incredible pace during these first few years.
Like how fast are we talking?
It's really remarkable. We see the emergence of motor skills, and their sensory perception is constantly being refined. Those jerky movements of a newborn gradually give way to crawling, walking, and eventually running, all within a relatively short time.
It's like they're little scientists.
Right.
Experimenting with their bodies, figuring out how things work.
Exactly. And their brains are like sponges, absorbing information from their environment.
So those early experiences really do matter. It's not just about meeting their basic needs, it's about creating an environment that supports all this growth.
Right, absolutely. The richness of their environment, how responsive their caregivers are, all of that plays a crucial role in shaping those developing brains.
It highlights the importance of early intervention programs, especially for children who might be facing challenges or growing up in disadvantaged environments.
I couldn't agree more. It's about giving every child the best possible start in life.
Okay, so let's talk about motor skills development. Watching a baby take their first steps, it's such a joyful moment.
Those milestones are truly heartwarming. But they're not just cute. They're also essential for a child's growing independence.
They're becoming little explorers. What are some of those key motor skills that develop during this time?
Think about it. With each attempt to crawl, walk, or grasp something, they're refining their coordination, strengthening their muscles, and understanding their body's movement in space.
It's a messy, chaotic process, for sure. Lots of spills and tumbles, but ultimately so rewarding to witness.
You're right. And there's nothing like seeing that "I can do it myself" look on a child's face.
It's like they're so proud of themselves.
They are. And that feeling of accomplishment fuels their curiosity and their drive to learn even more.
Makes sense. So as they get better at moving and interacting with their world, they gain a sense of independence, and that motivates them to learn even more.
Precisely. It's a wonderful cycle.
Okay, we've talked about the body and the brain. Now, what about those senses? How do babies start to make sense of all the sights, sounds, smells, and textures bombarding them?
Sensory development in infancy is fascinating. Newborns come into the world with their senses already working, but those senses aren't fully developed yet.
So they're taking it all in, but it's not super clear.
Right. Over those first few years, their vision sharpens, they can hear more sounds, and they develop a much more sophisticated sense of taste and smell.
It's like they're putting together a giant sensory puzzle.
I love that analogy. And as those sensory systems mature, they become more aware of their surroundings, more picky about what they like, and better at responding to those subtle cues in their environment.
That makes sense. So it's not just about experiencing pleasure and exploring. Those early sensory experiences are actually shaping how they perceive the world.
Right, exactly. And those sensory pathways are also laying the groundwork for cognitive and social emotional growth.
That's amazing. So even simple activities like playing with toys or listening to music can have a big impact on a baby's development.
A huge impact. We really need to be mindful of the environments we create for young children. We want those environments to be rich with sensory stimulation.
I agree. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the importance of those early relationships. It seems like infancy and toddlerhood is when the foundation for social and emotional development is really laid, right?
You're absolutely right. The bonds they form with their caregivers are so important. It really is the bedrock of their social emotional well-being.
So it's more than just meeting their physical needs. What else is important?
It's about those warm, responsive interactions that build trust and security. When a child feels safe and secure, they're more likely to explore their surroundings and engage with others.
And on the flip side, when those early attachments are disrupted, it can have a lasting impact.
Unfortunately, yes. It can affect their emotional well-being, their social skills, even their ability to form healthy relationships later on.
Wow, I'm remembering those famous attachment studies. Didn't they show how different attachment styles can play out in a child's behavior?
You're thinking of Mary Ainsworth's strange situation experiment.
That's the one.
Her research was groundbreaking. It showed how babies react differently when they're separated from and then reunited with their caregivers.
Right. And those patterns of relating to caregivers can actually influence our relationships throughout life.
That's what the research suggests. While attachment styles aren't set in stone, they can have a lasting influence on how we approach relationships, how we handle our emotions, and even how we see ourselves.
It's incredible to think that those early interactions can be so influential.
Yeah.
So those early years, they're not just about cute babies learning to walk and talk.
Not at all. They're about developing the building blocks for healthy relationships, emotional well-being, and a resilient spirit.
So much is happening beneath the surface.
It is. And amidst all this social and emotional development, those little ones are also rapidly developing their cognitive abilities. It's like they're tiny philosophers trying to figure out how the world works.
They're always asking why, even before they have the words to actually ask, right?
Exactly. And their main tool for exploring and understanding the world during this time is play.
Play. So it's not just about having fun.
It's essential for their cognitive development. Through play, they experiment with cause and effect, they learn about different objects, they practice problem solving, and they even develop their social skills.
Play really is the work of childhood.
You got it.
This makes me think of Piaget, that famous developmental psychologist. Didn't he have a lot to say about how children's thinking evolves?
Oh, absolutely. His theory of cognitive development is still incredibly influential today. He proposed that children go through distinct stages of cognitive development.
Okay, remind me of those stages again.
Well, during infancy and toddlerhood, they're in what he called the sensory motor stage. That's when they're mainly learning through their senses and motor actions.
So it's all about those hands-on sensory experiences we were talking about earlier.
Exactly. Think about a baby. They're touching everything, putting things in their mouths, shaking things, banging things. They're using their bodies to figure out how the world works.
And through those interactions, they develop a deeper understanding of things like object permanence.
Right. That's the understanding that things continue to exist even when you can't see them.
That's a huge cognitive leap. What else happens during this stage?
Well, we also start to see the emergence of symbolic thought. That means they start to understand that a word or a picture can represent a real object or an idea.
So that lays the groundwork for language and pretend play.
Exactly. Now, it's important to remember that Piaget's theory has been revised over the years. We now know that cognitive development isn't always as neat and tidy as he suggested.
Okay, so it's not like children hit these specific milestones at precise ages.
Right. But his work was groundbreaking, and it highlights the importance of creating environments that stimulate cognitive development, environments that encourage curiosity, problem solving, and a love of learning.
That makes sense. So what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to get from our discussion of infancy and toddlerhood?
I'd say the biggest takeaway is that those early years are a time of incredible growth and learning across all areas of development. It's about so much more than just meeting their basic needs.
It's about nurturing those developing brains, supporting their curiosity, and creating a loving and supportive environment where they feel safe to explore.
Well said. It's a reminder that we, as caregivers and as a society, have a tremendous responsibility to create the best possible environments for these little ones.
I agree. Those early experiences really do have a profound impact on their future development. Welcome back to our deep dive into human development. It's amazing to think about how much we've already covered. We've gone from conception to birth.
And explored those incredible first few years of life, infancy, and toddlerhood.
So much happens during those early stages. It's like development is on, fast forward. But for this last part, we're going to shift our focus to early childhood, those preschool years, from ages 3 to 5.
Oh, the preschool years. Those are fun.
They are. It's a time when kids have tons of energy, they're making friends, and they're asking why. About, well, everything.
And those little why questions can be quite insightful sometimes. They're really trying to understand the world around them.
It's true. So what are some of the things that make this stage of development unique?
Well, physically, they're becoming even more coordinated. Remember those motor skills we talked about? They're getting more refined. They're running, jumping, climbing.
So they're not just growing taller, they're really mastering those movements.
Exactly. And their fine motor skills are improving too. They're getting better at drawing, writing, using those little muscles in their hands.
It's like they're finally able to keep up with all those big ideas in their heads.
That's a great way to put it. And as they become more physically capable, their social world expands too. They're interacting more with other kids, making friends, learning how to navigate those social dynamics.
So they're learning to share, to cooperate, to stand up for themselves.
It's all part of the process, and all of this is happening alongside their cognitive development. Language is really blossoming during this time.
Oh yeah, they're becoming little chatterboxes.
They are. They're learning so many new words every day. Their memory's improving. They can focus their attention for longer periods, and their problem-solving skills are becoming more sophisticated.
And let's not forget about pretend play. Those imaginary games are so important for their development.
Absolutely. Pretend play is like a training ground for real life. It lets them experiment with different roles, explore their emotions, and develop their creativity.
It's amazing to watch how their imaginations run wild. It seems like they're constantly asking why about everything.
That's because their brains are working overtime trying to understand how the world works.
So those questions are a sign of their growing curiosity, not just them being annoying.
Exactly. And as adults, we need to encourage that curiosity. Instead of shutting down their questions, we should help them find answers. Or even better, guide them in figuring things out for themselves.
That's a good point. It's about fostering a love of learning, not just memorizing facts.
Couldn't agree more. Okay, speaking of learning, we should probably bring Piaget back into the conversation. Remember his stages of cognitive development?
Oh, right. Didn't he have a specific stage for early childhood?
Yes, he called it the pre-operational stage. It typically spans from ages 2 to 7.
And what happens during this stage?
Well, one of the key things is the development of symbolic thought, which we already touched on. That's their ability to use symbols, like words and pictures, to represent real things.
That's what allows them to engage in pretend play and understand language, right?
Exactly. Another hallmark of the stage is something Piaget called egocentrism.
Egocentrism. Doesn't that mean being selfish?
Not exactly. It means that children at this age have trouble understanding that other people might have different thoughts and feelings than they do.
So it's not that they're being intentionally inconsiderate, it's just how their brains are wired at this age.
Exactly. They see the world primarily from their own perspective, and then there's this concept of a lack of conservation.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means that they don't understand that certain properties of an object stay the same even if you change the way it looks. Like if you pour the same amount of water into a tall, thin glass and a short, wide glass, they might think the tall glass holds more water simply because the water level is higher.
Because it looks like more.
Exactly. Piaget argued that kids gradually overcome these limitations through experience and social interaction. They need to test their understanding, to experiment with different ideas.
It's all about active learning.
Right. And while Piaget's theory has been incredibly influential, it's important to remember that cognitive development doesn't always happen in these neat little stages. Every child is different.
So some kids might develop certain skills earlier or later than others.
Exactly. And that's perfectly normal. The key is to provide a supportive environment where they can learn and grow at their own pace.
I think this has been a really insightful look at early childhood. What are some of the main things you hope our listeners take away from this conversation?
I'd emphasize that this stage is a period of incredible growth and discovery across all areas of development. We see amazing progress in their physical abilities, their language skills, their cognitive abilities, and their social-emotional understanding.
It really is an exciting time.
It is, and it's a reminder that we as parents, caregivers, educators, and even just community members have a responsibility to create environments that nurture that potential, to give them the space and support they need to thrive.
Well said. Any final thoughts before we wrap up our deep dive into human development?
I guess my final thought would be this. Human development is a lifelong journey. It's a continuous process of growth and change, and those early experiences really do lay a foundation for everything that comes after. So let's cherish those early years, foster a love of learning, and create a world where every child has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
I love that. It's a beautiful message to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible deep dive into human development. We hope you enjoyed exploring the complexities of this fascinating field with us.